Welcome to SmartBear Academy, SoapUI Pro 301. We are live from the SmartBear Studio in Somerville, Mass. My name is Dana, and going to run through some housekeeping items before we get started with the training. As some of you may know, we will be running our very first user conference, September 12th to the 13th, SmartBear Connect. First day is going to have live interactive product training classes, about 7 different sessions on day 1. Day 2 has different speaking and insights from our SmartBear customers, different industry experts, so it's really jam-packed with a lot of great information. So I'll send the link into the chat box for registration, and you can email us at customers@smartbear.com if you are interested or have any other questions about it as well. But it is coming up in about a month, so hope to see you there. We download a handout for you. So the handout has different information for you on future classes, our community, support hub for the Ready API products and SoapUI. So there's a lot of information there for you as some resources as customers. So feel free to download the link for the handout in the handout section. And we love to make this class as interactive as possible, so please ask your questions into the questions pane. Mike will take periodic breaks to answer questions. We'll get to as many as we can during the class live. And at the end, when you do exit out of GoToWebinar, if you could take a brief moment to fill out our exit survey. These classes are built for you, so we really want to get the best feedback and be able to continue to build out these classes and have the topics that you, our customers, are interested in. This is the final of our training for this quarter. We will be starting up again with SoapUI advanced classes next quarter, sometime in the October timeframe. And we do host our Ready API classes monthly. And we do have a couple more service fee classes that still will be held later this month. So I'll send those links. They all are in the link to the handout, for registration for these classes. And if you're looking for any additional training, we do have one of our premium training partners, WiseClouds. They have on-site and on-demand training, also some video training that you can get, and certification. So very customized. If you're looking for the on-site or webinar training private for your company, just contact us at customers@smartbear.com for more information on that. And without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Mike, who is going to get started with the agenda and then dive right into the tool. So thank you, everyone.
And it looks like in the questions tab, there's the handout should be updated for the 301. Let me...
I think the content actually is the same. I do apologize. I might just have the wrong title, but the content in there should all be the same.
All right, so let me switch over to my presenter, right? So I should be showing my agenda for SoapUI Pro 301, and we have about 1 hour together, and we have a lot to get through. Okay, so we have done we've done Ready API, which is a Ready API overview. So that talked about how Ready API talks to functional testing, security testing, load testing, service virtualization, which allows you to mock and create different APIs as needed. Then for SoapUI in 201, we've talked about the basics of creating a test and data driving that. And then today we'll talk about extracting data, doing more advanced troubleshooting, going through more advanced options, and a lot of different additional steps that should help. Just to baseline this, hopefully you've seen this in 201, but I'm going to create a brand new test case that's data driven. So at some point I have imported an endpoint, right? So in this project we pointed to an endpoint that was a post against Google Maps. That created an interface here, okay? And I'm flying through this. This was really covered in 201, which is available, for the past recordings, for the past session. And then from this interface, from this REST endpoint that so this is the post against Google Maps. So from there, we're going to create a test case. Okay, and I'm again kind of flying through this. So this is going to be test case 301, and this is going to be maps lookup. So this is now going to be a REST call. Right now it's hard coded. There is a post, so we can send some data. Okay. Sorry, one sec. And when you send that through, you get a response, and we're going to validate the response. So in this particular case, the response is XML. So we're going to say status needs to be okay. So we're going to add an assertion for content that says status is okay, and that added an XML assertion down to the status element. So I know this was a really quick recap, but this again was covered very in detail in 201 and 101 sessions. From there, I want to very quickly data drive it. So we're going to use the data source and then map it to an external. So the data source is going to be mapped to an external Excel file that has different zip inputs. And we're going to say, so create a property from that. So this will start in cell A2. Here's the data that we work with. And we're going to go through different input cities, including this expect to fail. Okay, so we're going to map this input here. So this is going to be still XML. This is going to now map into the data source step for city. Okay, and the data source loop is going to iterate through it. So again, I purposefully went through this really at a high level, right? So all these transactions for different inputs, including the expect to fail that actually fails. We've covered a lot of this in 201. Okay. And what I've shown you is the use of a data source that feeds data in. What we often see is extracting that data back out, okay, so using a DataSink. So a data source allows you to feed data in from Excel files, from a database connection, from generating data, from CSV and other delimited files. And you can see here we have a city input, okay, and in the terms when it is successful, we have, so let's, for example, here, cache, just the first response. So when it is successful, we get a formatted address, right? So this comes back, instead of Boston, it says Boston, MA, USA, and it should do the same for all the different cities. So we can actually extract that data out. Okay, the easiest way to do that is using a DataSink. So we're going to insert a step called DataSink to extract data. Okay, so here we're also going to extract it to an external Excel file. And here we're going to just create an out file. Okay, so you could use the same Excel. Typically, I've seen Windows kind of lock it up and not allow you to read and write from the same file in the same test. So just to avoid that issue, I'm going to write out to out.xls, and I'm going to provide a worksheet. Okay, so that again, each value doesn't get overwritten. You could again provide the file, but in my experience, providing just the out file, providing the worksheet will allow you to extract that data out. And then to specify what data you're extracting, think of different columns, right? So this could be input city, okay? And then the second one is going to be formatted address. And then if you want to, let's do latitude and longitude, right? So we're going to be able to extract all that data out. Now for mapping input city, right-click and get data to map exactly what you're using for input, right? So here we're going with the data source city property, that's our input. When we submit that into the maps call, that comes back as a formatted address, right? So this is where we're using the input, we're looking at formatted address, and we're going to look at latitude and longitude as we extract them programmatically. So in DataSync, we can say, map the formatted response from maps response and pick this formatted address as a result. And then we'll do the same for latitude and longitude. So this does require a little bit of setup, but this is a one-time setup, and this will allow you to really look at all the different data in easy to understand Excel file. So here I've mapped latitude, I'm going to map response longitude. Okay. And now that all these mappings are created, all the property expansions are created, we can rerun the tests. Okay, so I'm going to copy the location of this out file. We can run through this, and you can see we're going through different iterations. We're writing stuff out with DataSync. And then you can see when this was our input file, let me just bring that in. So this is the input file where we input these cities, right? Then we also created this out file. So this was the result of the run, right? So these are the cities that succeeded. This is the corresponding formatted address. So every time you look, for example, for Chicago, it came back with Chicago, Illinois. And we actually get the latitude and longitude for each city. So this is our ability to, go from input to also extract data out. So as you can see, using this combination of data source and data sync allows you to do very powerful, data extraction, data transforms in many cases, work with different XML elements, JSON elements, and then export them in a way that, in tables or in files that are easy to understand. So again, you can use this for different things. For example, you can use a data sync to extract a piece into a file, to read that into a different test. So definitely, think about any kind of data extraction as a data sync, which is a configurable file where configurable step where you don't have to, write out any kind of crazy code to get data out. So this was our first item that I wanted to show you. So we kind of covered the extract data sync. I want to take a second and just, any questions, go back to the questions tab in GoToWebinar. So definitely ask. I am looking at that real time. Next, I want to talk about the transaction log. Okay, so this is, I want to kind of get more into helping you get into the details of all the transactions that are happening. So when you look at Ready API, you can see we now have a data source, data sync, right? All these steps that are being executed. So when we run through this, these are different steps in the setup for a test case. Okay, and then the transaction log is kind of each instance of each step. Now, by default, when you have a past step, so for example, this first lookup, by default, we won't show you what happened because it passed. It's fine. There's no issue, and we don't log that data because it does add a lot to memory. So if you do want to see exactly the details of what goes on, in your test case options, so there's a gear icon. Sorry, wrong keystrokes. Right here, right? So clicking on this gear, you can uncheck discard successful results. Then rerunning that same test can actually give you the full detail of what happened, right? So you can see in the first request, we submitted Boston, right? Then we saved data with the data sync, iterated with a different data source, right? And then next request used Chicago as input. So again, there's an options in a test case that allows you to uncheck discard successful results so that you don't just see the content for failures, but for each request response. Okay. There is a question. This is a great question about can you use data sync as a data source? So yes, technically, if you write out to an Excel file, you can then refer to that Excel file in the following data source. That is a common setup, right? So you can't use a step, but you can use the Excel file or a database table or whatever you're writing data out to as a future data source. So that's not a problem. So as I said, definitely ask questions. Let's go back to the transaction log. Another thing that you might have noticed, when we had expect to fail, so there was an expect to fail value, it failed and it stopped. Again, in the test case options, you can say don't abort on error, meaning when you fail, keep going. So this way, if you have, say, 1,000 different inputs and you have a failure on input 2, input 200, and input 800, you can run through all of those inputs once and find out exactly what failed, right? So here we had a failure. We still proceeded and had another successful run against Los Angeles as input, right? So now we were able to go through all the different inputs. Okay, so over here you can definitely look at all the different options. The most common ones I saw are as I shared, don't discard results, don't keep going if there is a failure, and then all of that is available in the transaction log. And then of course you can filter just by failed transactions, just by past transactions, by unknown, meaning you didn't provide an assertion, so maybe you don't have something. So maybe it passed or failed, you just didn't provide an assertion. But definitely provide assertions for your steps so that we understand pass or fail. Excellent. So if you have any other questions about transactions log, let me know. And you can see this actually also covered the test case options. So this we talked about how how to control how test cases are run. For authentication, they're not really test case options or test suite options. So for authentication, what you can do is you can apply authentication within the projects tab in the auth manager. You can provide different authentication. Okay, so for example, here we can create, basic authentication, NTLM, Spinego for Active Directory authentication, OAuth 1 or OAuth 2. So we're going to create basic profile, basic auth, right? We're going to say ABC. I'm just going to create some data. We're going to authenticate preemptively. And then when that is created, we can then, on the request side, apply the authentication, right? So we can say apply that basic auth profile that we created, and then you should be able to see authorization header. Okay. Now, if you want to apply more global authentication, and this is something that I think is very important, even though it doesn't really apply to test case options or test suite. So if you want to apply global authentication, what I would recommend is create an environment. So this is typically used to point to different environments like stage, UAT, etc., right? But you can say dev environment, copy the endpoints. This is an important piece. And then for your REST services, whenever you look up Google Maps, for example, apply this basic authentication profile, right? So now you can say for any test step that refers to maps, right, any kind of request, passed or failed, would apply the authentication in there. Let me see. So anyways, the environments will definitely let you handle that. There's a question for basic auth. Can you use additional inputs in addition to username and password, such as location ID? Potentially. So if you have more parameters for your authentication, it gets a little more customized. So what I would suggest is log a support ticket with us. We can help you out. You might not be dealing with basic auth, which is a standard. You might be dealing with something a little more customized. But the best way I definitely recommend is log a support ticket. Oh, this is what I missed. I apologize. So we applied environments. I set up the authentication for the environment. Then you should point to that environment and then rerun the test, right? And then any request step will apply that basic auth at that point. So this was my missing piece. This was a user error. I apologize. You have to then apply the environment for your test, right? And that applies globally, kind of at a project level. So as you can see, authentication, you can definitely apply globally, apply per environment. So if you have different authentication for dev, for stage, for UAT, you can definitely apply that as well. It says here we should look at test suite options. So the only thing really that's useful at test suite options. So here, say you have different test cases, right? So test suites are used to organize test cases. The most important option that I want to share with you is how to run them. Right, so here you can see we ran one test, then we ran another, then we ran a third. If you click on this option right here, you can run all the same tests in parallel. So if there isn't a dependency of running one test after the next, you can actually save some time by running all these test cases in your test suite in parallel. So that's a very, very important option that should hopefully help you speed up your test execution. Okay. All right. Next one takes us to a slightly different area, simulate an API. Okay, so right now what I've shown you is we call Google Maps, right? So we're checking for Boston. Here's our Boston data. We have latitude, longitude. We have a bunch of data. We don't have stuff like Fahrenheit, like elevation, for example. Okay, so we can simulate this API. We can actually control this. If I know for sure that there's going to be a change in the response, you can change the response itself. So this is going to take us into Service V, where I have a trial activated against it. But even if you don't have a professional license against Service V, you can still follow the steps that I'm showing you right now. So in projects where you have this structure of request response, run the response so you can get some data, and then right click and say add to vert, REST or SOAP vert, right? Then in service V, we can kind of understand what the method is, what the resource is, what the call should catch, and we can structure the response based on the data, right? So now we can say, okay, here's a bunch of components. We're going to add in elevation, right? There's no elevation here. So this is going to be 100 feet. Okay, so I just added this in. I'm going to run this. Now my local environment on port 8080 runs this very specific response. So now I can actually say, let's take so I can rerun this against different environments if I wanted to, or I can run this against the local environment. And then I can say, if I point instead of production, instead of Google Maps, if I point to a local environment, then I'm going to get a copy of this, okay, and this is going to include the elevation response. So again, going into Service V, with the extent that I've shown you, you can do that right now without a license. You can capture the response from project and customize it and modify it and run it locally for your local consumption. Then you can repoint that test and then start creating tests against something that you locally modify. Okay. So I'm going to take a moment. So hopefully this makes sense. And again, we talked about simulating an API. There's some good questions that are coming through, so I'm just going to take a moment and pause and answer some. So there's a question about running test cases in Test Suite in parallel, right? So when you set this up, this is something that I'm going to test. So when you set up a test case to run in parallel, that should be part of the project. So when you then point to that project from command line for automation, we should be able to pick that up. Okay, so there isn't anything specific that you should do for headless. And if you don't experience that behavior, if you do see some sequential execution, let me know, because that's definitely not the expectation. Then there's a question about running at one time. Is there a limit of 20 at a time? So that's not possible to control the limit of parallel test execution. Then there's a great question. How can we get reports from this tool? Okay, so when you run either a test case or test suite or project, so say you run this project, right? So you have some passes and failures, a bunch of stuff. After it finishes running, you can then generate a report at any level. Right, so here is the icon for generating reports in the GUI. And you can see there are different levels of reports, like project. So you should really, for your initial test, you can probably generate the first type of a report. And the first type in that dropdown is printable. It's something that you can share with the team. It's something that you can, once you generate it, provide it to your API developers, API providers. And you can see the reports that we generate are very detailed. So first we describe everything related to the project. Then as you page through, you can see all the different metrics related to the project, test suites, test cases, and then you can see kind of different execution. So this test suite failed, right? Then we can go further and look at different results. So then within test case, we see this step failed, this step passed, this step failed, test case failed, right? Then this one has everything fine. So basically, this one has a failure because the SLA took too long. And then for each failure, at some point, we're also going to start giving you, all the reasoning for the failure. So again, this one had a slow SLA, so we were expecting to get this in 500 milliseconds. We got this in 700 milliseconds, right? So this is kind of the level of detail we provide in the report. So the short of it is when you execute project, test suite, or test case, look at this icon. If you're looking to execute from command line, there are parameters that we provide as well. Okay. There's a question about, is there a way to monitor resources when running in parallel? There isn't, but if you're looking to, there's a concern about, for example, memory, there's definitely memory usage tuning that we can do. This is the best article on that. I am going to provide that in as an answer for everybody in the questions tab. So hopefully you see this article in there. Okay, so this allows you to tune, to use less memory, to increase the JVM side footprint of Ready API. So if you have any kind of issues with memory, with freezing, this article can usually address any of those issues. Okay. Then there's a question: can you run test suites in parallel? Yes. So that's a project option. So if you have multiple test suites, you can set them up to run in parallel with this icon over here. Okay. Great questions. All right. So we had a bit of a sidetrack, but that's great because it came from questions, from usage. So hopefully this was again useful. So we talked about simulating APIs. The next thing is and there, just to be clear, there is no reporting in open source. So that's an answer to the additional question as well. So the next thing I want to talk about is scale and customizing of different runs, right? So here we have a test suite with 3 different test cases, and then we can tag them and we can say this one is going to be a smoke test, right? This one is going to be a regression test. So we can create different tags, and this one is going to be both a smoke and a regression test. So we can run this in both environments, right? So then you can actually say, just worry about smoke testing, right, or worry about regression testing. So you can basically control tags to, to test different modules, to test different smoke or regression test subset of tests. So this is a way for you to control different tagging within different test cases and control different sets that you would want to run. Okay. Excellent. So after you're comfortable with tags, we can talk about different environments. This is some that we already touched on, right? So we've talked about setting up different environments, and you've seen that I set one up for dev, which points to maps with the authentication profile. So I can say, let's go to a local, right? Again, I'm going to copy the endpoints. And if you remember, I stood up a local copy. So here we are actually pointing to localhost 8080. Okay, so this is picking up the latest setup there. So now I can say, here's my test case. Here's my maps step. So this is going to point to dev, which is maps with authentication. So this is going to add an authorization header. Or we can say, you know what, I'm going to point to a local API. So this changes the endpoint, right? And this is going to give me that customized elevation response. So I'm doing this for demonstration purposes, how you can, kind of globally change out different inputs and responses and control different environments and where things are pointing to, and different authentication schemes that might apply for your, REST or SOAP services. And again, I'm showing this against a local or a production API. In practice, this would typically be configured against dev, stage, UAT, and different environments that you would have, that copy your APIs there as well. Okay. And then there's a question, can you assign different data sources to different environments? So that's a great question. So yes, you can assign different JDBC connections. So if you point to different databases, right? So say here we have a database connection to DBMS to DB2, right? So this is just sample connection, right? I can go into my environments, and for each one, I can override my database connection, right? So this one is then going to point to, say, Informix, right, with different value. And for dev, it's going to point to a different database. So it could be a different database, could be a similar database with different credentials. So if you're connecting to, through a data connection to a database connection, this would change with each environment. Okay, so that's one way. If you're connecting to, for example, an Excel file, right? So you can see that this is kind of the folder I'm pointing to, or the file that I'm pointing to. Then what I would recommend, and this is fairly advanced, but just bear with me. And I lost my place. So what I would recommend is using a project property. Okay, so this is my project, and I can add a custom property of XLS file. Then this is the file itself, right? And then referring to that project property. So we can say get data for XLS file project property. And then again, with different environments, you can actually override different custom project properties, right? So this is where you can point to zip data 2, zip data 1, right? So for example, here you can point to a different file, right? So this is local. So you can definitely get very creative with different environments and, try to run them against local, where you can see this local file doesn't exist, or point them to the original file, and then you can still, extract the data from a result set. This will work, believe it. So, right, with the default environment, you can see. Anyways, but yeah, so through controlling project properties in the environment, you can definitely control different, not only database connections, but pointers to files. Excellent. TestRunner. So this is a big one. So TestRunner is our headless automation, right? So when we talk about creating all these tests, running them, etc., what you want to do is automate a lot of this. So if you go into where you install Ready API, and I'm using a Windows machine, so I'm going to browse to my program files, SmartBear, Ready API 2.1. If you use Linux or Mac, you would just go to the corresponding folder. Okay. So in there, in the bin subdirectory, we have TestRunner, and this is your path to automation. Okay. In addition to this file, because you need to put the right properties on what to automate, you can go into Ready API and sort of kick off TestRunner wizard to say, here's my TestRunner, let's save the project. You can restrict down exactly to what you want to test, whether it's a test suite or a test case. You can override to different environments, so you can execute that headless automation against different environments, right? You can definitely specify different tags at headless mode as well. And then you can generate reports. So this is where I advocate generating JUnit reports in, say, your workspace directory for JUnit XML format. So if you use automation, this is called Maven Surefire format. It is supported by most CI tools, right? So if you have continuous integration in place, this can help you automate that. So when you say launch, let's save this project really quickly, you can see this is not only my TestRunner reference, but this is the full, I know it's small, probably small on your screen, but this is basically the full parameters that I would use to automate it. Right, so this is something, like I said, it's very extensive. So I use that for my local example, local Jenkins, where I can automate functional tests. And again, all I had to do to configure that was reference to, as a build step in there, reference to TestRunner executable with the right parameters, with the right projects, and then parse out the XML report that comes back. Okay, so that gives me kind of full automation, gives me historical reporting, gives me a pass-fail, and if there's a failure, it actually gives me reasons for that failure. Okay, so definitely lets you do a lot. All right, so you can see this tool definitely goes very deep. So at this point, we've talked about, let me go back to my PowerPoint. We've talked about TestRunner automation. Then there's also more test steps. So we've covered there's a question about Maven and Jenkins and reports. So the short of it is there is a Maven plugin also available for Ready API for SoapUI Pro. Reach out afterwards. We'll provide documentation and sample POM files for that config. And if there's a question about how to configure it specifically in your Jenkins environment, again, reach out to our support, reach out to our account reps, and they'll be able to set that to work with you to help you set that up. There's a question about they're using Visual Studio and Azure and there's questions with automation. Again, our support team's phenomenal, so and our account reps are very dedicated. So for that one, reach out to them and they'll be able to help you and specify that. Okay. Excellent. So more test steps. So we have a lot of different test steps. So we can, within the test flow, right now we can data drive, we can call different APIs and different sequences and pass values through. But then you can also do other things, right? So for example, you can test SOAP, REST, combination of both. You can call database directly, other APIs as well. You can add a delay step. So if you need to wait and think for something to happen, this can give you a delay of, by default a second, but you can modify it, say, to half a second, right? So this allows you to actually pause and think, after every half second. And map this back to just a hard-coded zip file. So you can see, every time we get to a delay, there is a half-second wait on that level. And then, for manual step, again, sometimes you need to do something manually, or like, I don't know, check a website or check a status update. So there is a step that allows you to do a manual verification as well, right? So check status is updated, right? So this one isn't too common, but at that point when we get to the manual step, I can manually check that the status is updated, say, yep, it's okay. So let's make this pass, right? So again, this isn't common, and if you execute this in headless mode, we'll suppress this. But this is an interesting step that definitely helps you kind of intervene and make sure that within that flow something's going on, or everything's working correctly. And then send mail step is common as well. It doesn't actually send the report, which is what most people ask, but it can help you send maybe like a confirmation email based on the transaction that the API did. Okay, so that's an additional step here as well, to help you send mail, connect to your SMTP, and send it through. We also have SOAP vert response and REST vert response steps. I'm not going to go into the detail of that setup, but these are common for basically webhooks and asynchronous HTTP services. So that's something actually, right, so that's the asynchronous event. So you can make, an original call, get a response, and then set up, say, a REST vert response to wait for the async response to come back from a webhook. So that's, fairly intuitive, kind of given the complexity and nature of that API call. So if you deal with webhooks, let us know. We can definitely automate that test as well. Right, so as you can see, there's a lot of steps for testing asynchronous events, for delays, manual, and send email. If there's other steps that you might have seen in, in Ready API, definitely let me know. More than happy to elaborate on that as well. All right, Groovy scripting. This is an interesting one, especially. So there's a great question. Sorry, let's go back to the additional steps. There's a question about DataGen. So what I would recommend. Let's go back to this data source, right? So what I would recommend is instead of using a DataGen step, it is a bit deprecated between you and me, right? Use a data source step and use a data generator option in this step. So now if you have a city, you can auto-generate a city, right, as an example. So we have a lot of different options. So let's go with an example city, right? Let's generate 5 different examples. And then here you can see we can fly through different cities, right? And then if you remember, I'm going to open that out Excel file once this is done, and I'm going to show you kind of the different inputs. So here you can see different cities that we auto-generated, different responses that came back. So instead of using a DataGen test step, I'd recommend you still use data source, but look at data generator option in data source. Okay. There's a question about, can we handle 302 response from a service? Yes. So 302 is a redirect. For each step, there's a way to say, do you want to follow that redirect? So that's a property on the REST step. So you may want to go through with that redirect, or you may not, right? So that's a configurable option. And again, you can add an assertion for what is a valid status code. So you can say, maybe you do expect a 302, right? So the short of it is yes, we can definitely accommodate for 302 responses. Great questions coming in. Let's go back to the agenda though. So with Groovy scripting, this is a hot topic, right? So with Groovy scripting, you can literally do anything, right? And I've had people do anything and everything under the sun. In the professional version, I want you to not think of Groovy scripting as a first resource. It's a last resource, right? In my experience.
Starting the class right now, and
so what I would recommend is use Groovy scripting for customization, right? So for example, add in, let's do this. So here we have a login, right? So here we have a sequence going through login, search by, logout, right? So here, once we log in, here's a session ID. I'm going to insert a Groovy script, and then in this Groovy script, I can do a condition, right? So I can say, if session ID has something, right, then do a search, else don't do a search. So with Groovy scripting, as you can see, it's used for customization and customizing your flows to your conditions. So, checking for ranges, checking for different things. So with Groovy scripting, we actually have a number of functionality to help you write out Groovy script much better. One is you can use the right-click and get data to still get to different test responses, right? So here we're looking at a login response, and we're trying to grab the session ID. So this allows us to grab the session ID as a response variable, right? So using a right-click, we can definitely look into what's going on. Then, if I use control space, we can actually go and use code completion. So here I'm going to very quickly, write out that session ID that we refer to. So here's an example. So here's the session ID that we have. So now if I say, if, for now, let's just control true, right? I'm going to kind of hard code this. So again, I'm going to use the auto completion to say, go into get test case, get test step by name, and we're going to look at by, or let's say by, right? That's a test step that we are going to control, and we're going to say if true, then disabled is true. Okay, then else disabled is false. So here you can see you can definitely run through different steps. So this allows you to disable or enable steps, right? So this is a way for you to control different conditions during the flow. And so definitely put in your own condition instead of a hard-coded true or false. But you can definitely you can see, using code completion, using right-click get data, you can write those Groovy scripts really quickly. And then another thing you can do, and this is fairly new as well, is you can actually debug different test cases. So here I added a breakpoint, and now I can say when I run this test case, run this in debug mode. So you can see by the time we got to this if condition, I can actually see all the different variables, right? So I can actually see the session ID that's going on. I can see all the different TestRunner variables, and then I can either step in, step over, resume, go through a different flow. So again, don't just jump into Groovy scripting, because we do have DataSinks to extract data. We have, right-click to pass values through. Do use Groovy scripting for conditional stuff, saying like if this is equal to a sum of this, or this is within the greater than this, less than that. That's where you use Groovy scripting. Use the right-click get data to get specific values. Use the code completion with control space, and then definitely Groovy debugging will help you troubleshoot any kind of issues. Okay. There's a question about how do you control conditional pass-fail. So I've shown you a Groovy script step. For a conditional pass-fail, use a script assertion, right? So this is where you do script assertion, and then again you can use get data to, for example, get. So we're in the search response value, right? So we can say here's the response, and then you can say assert. Whoops. Response equal to item 1, through 5 or something, right? So this allows you to do conditional stuff. Oh, my bad. So this allows you to, control conditional stuff. Obviously, here I wrote a very simplified Groovy assertion, but this is where you can do conditional statements, right? Anything. So for asserting, use a Groovy script assertion. There's a question about you having to test FTP or SFTP. Unfortunately, that's an example we have to jump into Groovy. So right now, we do help you test different APIs. So anything SOAP, HTTP, REST, but we don't have FTP out of the box. Okay, so right now, you would have to rely on a Groovy script step, or potentially a Groovy script assertion step to test FTP or SFTP. Excellent. So you see I spent some time on Groovy scripting. Again, this is a very, very advanced topic that's very common, especially across developers who love coding. And you can see this allows you to literally do anything. Plugins. That's another kind of rarely mentioned advanced feature. So in Ready API, we have a lot of functionality already in, right? But we also have plugins that allow you to expand the functionality beyond just what we provide out of the box. And these are more for customized, for example, API management platforms. So if you happen to have WSO2 or CA, portal, API portal in place, or Amazon Gateway, these plugins can help you enhance a test against APIs that are managed in those gateways. Okay. Then we also provide, for example, Postman plugin and ability to import Postman collections, HAR files, etc. So here's an example of HTTP REST discovery plugin. So you can see I can install this plugin real time. So we can download, install, run this. I think I had this already, probably overrode it. And then as an example here, right, we have a feature, it's fairly advanced, about API discovery, where we can look at proxy. Actually, sorry, this is kicked off this way. New project, REST discovery. So now you can actually import a HAR file as an example to create a bunch of different tests. So again, definitely go through different plugins. We do have a lot hosted where, if you have a custom or if you have a specific API management portal or a not such a common descriptor. So if you're not using Swagger, but if you're using RAML, we have plugins that support that. Same with API Blueprint. And if you have if you want to add something to Ready API because it's common to you and your company, we can definitely provide you information on how to write a plugin so that people, can simply install that or maybe even roll that out automatically and then have that feature customized to your team, to your environment, right, that we can enhance as a plugin. Forgotten features. You know what? I'm going to skip this one because we had such great questions. I think that they actually addressed a lot of the forgotten features. Um, there's a question about important RAML and MuleSoft plugin. So yes, that is a plugin around that. So we definitely can import RAML, I think 0.8. So you can definitely install that, update it, and then from there you can go and import RAML definitions, as I'm showing you here. So run test case step. So this is the last step that I want to show you that's very, very important as well. So we keep talking about, you know, different tests and test scenarios and tags, etc., right? But let's pretend that we have something in common. So we have a common functionality. So let's pretend that we have this login that I want to reuse. So I'm going to create a new test case. I'm actually going to create everything. New test suite. So we'll have test suite common, and then this is going to be common login. Okay, and this is going to be a login step. So you can see in this project we now have a common login that has a request response and say a session ID. Okay, so now if I'm creating a different test case, right, or I can basically do a reference to that common login. So I can now add a run test case step, right? So it's literally a step called run test case that can point to that other test case, if that makes sense, right? So this is something that, you know, there's a way to pass values through properties, to use it, reuse it, etc. But if there's something in common that you want to set up, such as a login, this will definitely allow you to refer to that setup within the, and modularize your tests, where you can, you know, create different test cases that could be reused, and then you can kick that off as a run test case. So this way, if I ever update this test step or test case with different credentials, for example, I don't then have to go into every reference. It's just going to pick up the update. Okay, so this will definitely help you out there. So, you know, it's pretty straightforward when it comes to run test case test step, but it will help you modularize and refer to different tests. It will help you definitely, you know, control different pieces that could be reused and really scale there as well. Okay. Finally, you know, I want to talk about monitoring your APIs. This is more often used on the operations side of things. So while today we talk about functional testing and ensuring that everything works functionally, right? APIs work. We talked about automation. What we often see happen is when you push things to production, right? Things might change in production. Firewalls might get updated. Rules might change. Maybe someone pulls a plug. Maybe, you know, there's additional latency added in. So for that, we have an ability to monitor your APIs. This pulls you into alert site, where you can either create an account or log into an alert site dashboard to continuously monitor your APIs, right? So this will basically, again, this takes us into a different product, but this will help you periodically monitor your APIs. So maybe every 5 minutes, maybe every hour, and you'll be able to you know, ensure that if there's any changes, so like I said, you know, SLAs are broken, API is not responding, the data that's coming back is not in the format that you expect. This will alert your team and, you know, send a page to your operations team, send an email, you know, call them, whatever they want to configure. Okay. So yeah, so there's some questions about test server. So let us reconnect. This one was more focused on SoapUI Pro with 301. There's some additional questions about check-in requests and responses when you run test case. So when this should still give you kind of a pass-fail. So you can say check for existence false. So that should kind of pick up the pass-fail in there. So yeah, otherwise, I think I've been kind of addressing questions as they go along. So we're about 5 minutes shy of top of an hour, right? And you can see we covered quite a bit on the agenda list. We talked about extracting data. So you hopefully have seen an ability to add data, so read data. Now you can actually write data. We talked about different transaction logs and how you can, continuously record all the logs whether or not things failed. You can, also apply global authentication, run test cases and test suites in parallel. How you can virtualize and simulate an API response. How you can control and select different sections of tests with different tags. How you can spin up and reuse tests for different environments like stage, UAT, production, etc. How you can automate everything through command line with TestRunner, and then add more test steps, such as add delays, test asynchronous event responses, add in some manual interactions or send emails to confirm that some transaction happened. We talked about advanced Groovy scripting, how you can definitely control different conditions and involve Groovy debugging to ensure that when things fail that you know about that. We talked about expanding Ready API with plugins. So for example, one use case came up where someone wants to import RAML, so that's something that we can do with an extra plugin that isn't loaded by default. With forgotten features, we definitely addressed questions along the way, so hopefully, this addressed some of the questions there. Talked about modularizing your tests with run test case step, and then finally reusing your tests for monitoring or for your operations team to monitor your production APIs. So finally, there's a question about the recording of this session, so Dana can provide more info.
Yeah, definitely. So they will be listed on the SmartBear Academy page. If you've already registered for this class, you'll be able to access the video. If you send it to anybody who hasn't registered, they just need to fill out the GoToWebinar registration page. So it will be emailed out to you automatically. Look for it from GoToWebinar. It's not going to come from customers at smartbear.com. It will come to you from GoToWebinar. So that should come out tomorrow morning for you. And I just added the link to the Academy page where future registrations are, and then links to register to access videos for past recordings as well. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for all of your great questions and interaction. We appreciate it, and thank you, Mike. A lot of information and detail was covered today. So
yeah, if I crammed in too much, I apologize, but hopefully bits of it were very useful.
Thank you, everyone, and we will have dates announced for 201 and 301 for next quarter later this month. Hope to see and meet some of you at SmartBear Connect next month. We look forward to it here in Boston on September 12th and 13th. Myself will be there, Mike will be there, a lot of the SmartBear team, so looking forward to it, and hopefully you have a good rest of the day, and thank you for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Have a good day.